What if the world's most powerful family didn't just control banks, but biology itself? What if every fortune they built came with a hidden cost, recorded not in gold, but in blood? Tonight we open a vault that was never meant to be opened, a vault of missing names, burned ledgers, and coded diagnoses that stretch across 2 centuries, from the alleys of Frankfurt to the halls of London, and through clinics where even doctors were forbidden to sign their names. This is the side of the Rothschild legacy history was paid to forget. As you watch, ask yourself this: how much of your family's past would you hide to preserve its future? Welcome to the 7th mark. Before we begin, write down in the comments where you're watching from, and the time right now. It helps us see how far this mystery travels. And if you love uncovering the truths history tried to bury, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear has been locked away for over 100 years. This is the untold story of the Rothschild family's most disturbing genetic secret. A story money tried to silence, but memory refused to forget. In the last years of the 18th century, the air of Frankfurt's Judengasse hung heavy with the scent of metal and ink. Meyer Amschel Rothschild, a money changer of modest means, began to trade not in goods, but in trust itself. From a cramped house marked by a red shield, Zum Rothschild, he offered loans to princes, safe-kept their secrets, and learned how knowledge could be worth more than coin. He understood what few men of his age did. The world was moving toward a new currency: information. By the 1790s, he had 5 sons and a plan to extend himself through them. Each would carry the family seal into a different capital: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. From these cities, they would lend to governments and monarchs, move troop pay across borders, and learn the news of wars before anyone else. Letters coded in symbols and numbers moved faster than armies, binding Europe in an invisible web of credit and confidence. As their fortune expanded, so did their reputation for secrecy. Every transaction was recorded, yet few outside the family ever saw a complete ledger. Messengers carried sealed pouches. Clerks signed oaths of silence. Even within the brothers' correspondence, names became initials, and sums were hidden behind ciphers known only to them. To their clients they offered absolute discretion. To their rivals they offered nothing at all. Contemporaries marveled at their reach and feared their opacity. One journalist in the Times wrote in 1818, "Their halls are always lit, their agents always in motion. They do not appear to tire as other men tire." To some it was admiration, to others unease that no mortal enterprise could move so smoothly without some hidden engine driving it. In the drawing rooms of Europe, rumors grew that the Rothschilds' wealth was not entirely of this world, that their continuity had a cost paid in private, behind their banking hut. Halls stood rules as strict as any religion. Family first, records sealed, alliances measured like balances on a scale. They lent to both sides of wars but revealed loyalties to none. Each son reported to Frankfurt like a limb to a heart, and in return the patriarch controlled every pulse of information. Letters from Meyer Amschel often ended with a reminder: keep silent, for silence is profit. Historians would later call the 5-branch system the first international banking network. But what made it immortal was not its capital. It was its control over news, timing, and secrecy. To learn before others was to own the future. To speak was to lose it. Thus was born a dynasty whose foundation stone was not gold, but silence itself. By the time Meyer Amschel died in 1812, his descendants ruled the markets of Europe from behind curtains of respectability. The accounts balanced, but questions remained. Why their ledgers contained so few personal notes? Why letters were burned after reading? Why the family motto spoke not of faith or honor, but of endurance? Perhaps the answer lies in the pattern he set, that to survive, they must own not just money, but the truth itself. What he built was not merely a bank. It was an empire of silence, a system where information was currency, and secrecy was the interest it earned. And from that silence would grow a legacy that even time has struggled to expose. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild name had become a dynasty unto itself, so vast that outsiders no longer entered easily. The family's wealth crossed borders, but their marriages did not. From London to Vienna, from Paris to Naples, the same names repeated like a closed equation. What had begun as a symbol of unity soon hardened into policy. Marriage for a Rothschild was not a matter of affection. It was an entry in a ledger. Letters between patriarchs read less like family correspondence and more like contracts. In one, a father warns his daughter, "Do not look beyond our own house. The strength of our fortune is its unity, and unity is preserved by blood." The words were tender only in tone, never in meaning. Suitors from outside families found doors politely closed. Love, if it existed at all, was expected to occur only after signatures dried. The pattern was precise. A cousin in Paris would wed a cousin in Vienna. Their children would marry back into London's branch. The same surnames appeared again and again in wedding announcements printed across Europe's society columns, less as celebration than confirmation that the circle held firm. The family tree began to twist inward, its branches looping over themselves until it resembled not growth, but containment. Behind the polished portraits and public harmony, unease crept quietly. Private letters from doctors and advisers began using careful euphemisms. Delicate constitutions, frail temperaments, nervous dispositions. These were never written in alarm, only in the cool language of observation. But repetition made the pattern clear. The strategy that preserved the empire's gold was exacting another kind of interest, one not paid in currency. Historians note how the Rothschilds' own correspondence betrays the first cracks. A letter from the Paris branch laments, "A cousin too young and unwilling, but the match ensures stability." Another unsigned adds, "Love is unreliable. Blood is not." The phrase reads like doctrine, yet underneath it runs a current of resignation, as though even they sensed the cost of their perfection. The family's social circle narrowed further with each generation. Balls once filled with diplomats and merchants grew exclusive to cousins and their children. Invitations extended only to relations, a word that came to mean both kinship and boundary. To outsiders, the family appeared unshakable. To those within, it began to feel airless. In public, they maintained the image of unity, 5 branches operating as one mind. In private, whispers surfaced of cousins prone to melancholy, of heirs kept from public life under the explanation of travel abroad. None of these stories were confirmed, yet all carried the same quiet implication, that isolation, once a strategy, was turning into inheritance. By the century's end, the policy had fulfilled its promise. No fortune lost, no alliance betrayed, but at what cost? The ledgers still balanced, yet the bloodlines no longer did. Beneath the weight of gold and duty, something invisible had begun to shift, and the dynasty's silence was starting to sound like denial. In the archives of a forgotten Parisian clinic, historians uncover a ledger whose silence speaks louder than its ink. The pages, browned and brittle, date to the mid-19th century, a period when noble families paid not for cures, but for discretion. It is here, among fading Latin notations and coded initials, that a pattern begins to emerge. The ledger was unlike any other. Instead of full names, it listed only letters M.R., L.R., followed by brief phrases, recurring visions, auditory disturbances, family requests privacy. The handwriting is brisk, almost anxious, as if written in haste. To the untrained eye, it is routine medical shorthand. But to historians, the repetition of initials, the recurring family symbols, and the careful spacing suggest intention rather than coincidence. A marginal annotation, DS, appears again and again. In the medical language of the day, it meant dérangement de l'esprit, a polite avoidance of the word madness. Another mark, a tiny ink triangle, remains unexplained. Some scholars interpret it as a symbol for hereditary cases. Others dismiss it as meaningless ornament. But its persistence on the pages corresponding to wealthy patrons raises questions that will not quiet. An unsigned letter, preserved in the archives of the Académie nationale de médecine, deepens the intrigue. A Paris physician wrote, We treat those whom the city must not see. Their names never leave these walls. The timing matches the ledger exactly. Whether the author tended to the Rothschild family or merely wrote of them is unproven, but the alignment of dates and the echo of the initials keeps speculation alive. As the historians compare pages, they notice violence in the paper itself. Several entries are slashed through with dark ink, the quill cutting into the parchment. Entire lines are obliterated as though struck out in fury. When light passes through the P, aper, faint impressions emerge, ghostly outlines of erased sentences. One fragment remains readable. R. Unfit for continuation. Family present. Request total silence. Then the blot swallows the rest. The discovery unsettles even the cautious. Some claim the ledger is no more than a routine record, anonymized for privacy. Others see deliberate concealment, a quiet burial of genetic or psychological affliction within Europe's most powerful bloodline. Each side cites the same evidence, only their interpretations differ. Yet both agree on one point. The redactions are purposeful. Someone decided what the future could and could not know. Today, the ledger rests in controlled preservation, its meaning still contested. Scholars debate the ethics of reading what was meant to stay hidden, but every glance under magnification reveals something more, the human instinct to protect legacy at the cost of truth. And so the question lingers in the silence between pages. Who was M.R.? A patient? A daughter? Or a name too dangerous to write in full? Whatever the answer, the ledger has already spoken. Not in what it says, but in what it refuses to. The trail begins not in a diary, but in a ledger of departures, Vienna, 1843. One name is missing. In its place, a notation. Travel under family escort. Private matter. The line is neat, bureaucratic, and final. To later archivists, it reads less like a record of movement than an instruction to erase. The story of the unnamed cousin unfolds entirely in paperwork. A letter from Frankfurt to Vienna dated that same spring states, "Arrangements have been made. Health requires distance. Please receive him without delay." No name, no diagnosis, just the tone of authority that ends inquiries before they begin. Attached to it, an invoice, carriage hire, private room, physician's retainer, signed not by family but by proxy. Every trace of identity has been replaced with logistics. Subsequent correspondence tightens the secrecy. A note from the receiving physician confirms arrival. Patient delivered in good order. Rest recommended. Correspondence henceforth to be restricted. After that, silence. The clinic's register contains only a blank space between two ordinary admissions, as though someone physically lifted his existence from the page. The few surviving fragments reveal the machinery of control. One attendant's memorandum mentions a gentleman whose name is not spoken. Another letter, unsigned but traced to the Paris branch, instructs, "No mention in society columns. Confine discussion to travel for education." The pattern is unmistakable. Disappearance disguised as discretion. Within months, Vienna society begins to whisper. A Rothschild cousin, last seen at a garden fete, has gone abroad for his nerves. The explanation repeats across letters and newspapers, identical phrasing suggesting orchestration rather than chance. By autumn, even the gossip has gone quiet. His name no longer appears in correspondence or social directories. The only surviving clue to his final whereabouts is a transfer slip from a private estate outside Graz, payment for personal maintenance. Historians infer that he was relocated there under medical supervision, perhaps indefinitely. The accounts continue for 6 years, then abruptly stop. No death certificate follows. Modern scholars call this episode the first recorded internal exile within the Rothschild family, a model for later vanishings handled with the same precision, each step documented, every detail obscured. What survives is a paper ghost, the shape of a life maintained just enough to prove it once existed, then methodically folded out of sight. Among the last pieces of evidence is a torn diary page found among estate papers decades later. The ink has faded to brown, but the hand is steady. The writer describes a journey to the place where windows do not open. No names appear, only resignation written between careful lines. The final sentence stops historians cold. I was not asked. I was sent. Within the Rothschild archives, beyond the ledgers of gold and government loans, lie folders wrapped in red ribbon and hidden behind rusted locks. These are not records of finance, but of frailty. Suppressed medical files discovered only in fragments, retrieved from clinics in Paris, Vienna, and London. Each bears the same tone of restraint, careful handwriting, euphemistic phrasing, and a deliberate absence of names. One report, half faded, begins simply. Patient of prominent lineage, persistent visions, speech disordered. Condition deemed hereditary. Recommend continued observation. The entry ends without a signature, as though authorship itself carried risk. Decades later, another file mirrors the pattern. Heir unsteady in conduct. Blood weakness suspected. Advise privacy above all. In these lines, medicine gives way to discretion. Diagnosis dissolves into diplomacy. The repetition of language becomes its own confession. Phrases such as nervous disposition, melancholic strain, and unsteady temperament recur across decades, always attached to unnamed patients of considerable heritage. To the physicians of the time, it was a code, a way to describe psychological disorders without staining a dynasty's public veneer. One note written in Latin along the margin captures the moral tension. Non dicendum palam. It must not be spoken openly. Historians analyzing these documents find themselves divided. Some caution against over-interpretation, pointing to 19th century habits of euphemism. Others, noting the consistency of initials, dates, and phrasing, argue that the pattern cannot be coincidence. Every generation, it seems, produced another delicate heir, another patient confined to private care, under the watchful eye of discretion. The secrecy itself became hereditary. A diary recovered from a private physician offers a rare personal glimpse into the unease. They speak of fortune as armor, he wrote, but I see in their children's eyes that the inheritance is not only gold. The ink trembles on the page, as if the act of writing endangered him. His observation echoes across the century, that power can insulate a family from scrutiny, but not from itself. Another unsigned memorandum, found among the same collection, reads almost as a prayer disguised as protocol. A delicate nature of mind, prone to disturbances not of this world. Best not to name the illness, lest it shame the house. The choice of words suggests both compassion and complicity. A doctor aware that silence was part of his duty. Among these fragments, one final page concludes the file. The paper is darkened by age. The handwriting, unlike the others, is precise and unflinching. The author, identified only by the initial D, ends his report with the kind of sentence that stops the room cold. Her condition is beyond remission. The line continues regardless. It is not a statement of medical fact, but of inevitability, a recognition that the family's greatest inheritance was not just wealth, but the quiet endurance of what it could never publicly name. She was introduced to society as Liberty Rothschild, a name chosen, perhaps ironically, to evoke promise. In the early records of London society, her presence is unmistakable. She appears in guest lists beside cabinet ministers and poets, her charity work noted briefly in the Morning Chronicle. Portraits survive from her youth, dark dress, pale eyes, posture composed with practiced confidence. But as the years advance, the traces begin to fade. The first shift comes in the medical archives. A physician's note, preserved from the 1850s, records, "Patient exhibits disturbances of thought, periods of withdrawal. Family requests utmost discretion." The entry ends there. No diagnosis, no outcome, no continuation. Another letter, written by a relative in Paris, refers obliquely to her state. Her condition worsens. The house has grown quieter since her illness. Beyond that, silence. By the following decade, Liberty's name disappears from newspapers altogether. The society pages that once printed her attendants now list her siblings instead. Family genealogies, always meticulous in other respects, begin to blur her details. Dates altered, birth year misprinted, middle name dropped. In one family tree copied at the turn of the century, her branch is replaced with a dash, as though the ink itself hesitated. Historians searching for her trace encounter only a mission. The official family archives, preserved with near obsessive completeness, contain entire boxes labeled with her generation, yet none bearing her name. Even her baptismal record in Frankfurt is missing its margin notation of death, a detail customarily filled in. It is as though history itself was instructed to forget. A single newspaper clipping survives in a private collection, an unsigned report from the Illustrated London News, noting that a lady of considerable fortune has retired from society due to fragile health. No name is mentioned, but the date aligns precisely with the disappearance of Liberty from social record. The phrasing is characteristic of Victorian discretion, designed to shield families of status from scandal. Yet the omission feels deliberate, not protective. Privately, relatives maintained a vocabulary of avoidance. Letters reference the withdrawn one, the house in silence, or our cousin abroad. The last verifiable document, an estate ledger from 1864, lists ongoing expenses for care and maintenance, location withheld. Payments continue for 8 years, then stop abruptly. No obituary follows. No grave is marked. Genealogists cataloguing the Rothschild archives in the 20th century remark on the peculiarity. Every heir accounted for except one. Dr. Elise Marron, who studied the family's patterns of omission, wrote simply, "Erasure this consistent cannot be accident." She concluded that Liberty Rothschild had become a symbol of what the dynasty most feared, evidence that the shadows described in private files had taken form in daylight. What remains of Liberty's life fits into a single uncertain reference, a note in a faded diary kept by an attending nurse. She spoke as though to voices only she could hear. It is the last sentence in the record, the only surviving acknowledgement that she lived, and perhaps the reason she was made to vanish. The London inquiry begins with absence. Researchers expect drawers of case histories. They find cabinets rattling empty and folders relabeled to nothing. A clinic known for treating the discreet wealthy has years where the paper trail goes dark. An archivist who later reviewed the books puts it plainly. Entire stretches are not an error, it is an erasure. Testimony from former staff sharpens the outline of what's missing. A nurse, speaking under anonymity years later, recalls that certain arrivals could not be written in full. Names were reduced to slips, never entered into the ledgers. One day the slips were taken and the cabinet locked for good. Another line in her memory is harder to shake. We are not healers here. We are keepers of silence. Indirect traces remain. An unsigned case note describes a patient of considerable heritage, instructions from family that no record be kept beyond the room. The handwriting itself seems to flinch. The official accounts offer no matching entry, but the billing ledgers do. Large payments, regular retainers, nothing itemized. Money acknowledges what the files refuse to name. Outside the clinic walls, the consequences look administrative rather than medical. Staff are dismissed without explanation. Storerooms once marked with initials are sealed. Boxes are moved after hours. One attendant remembers the smell that lingered in the corridor. Smoke from the courtyard bins on a night when everyone was ordered inside. Medical historians caution that great families often purchase discretion. Even they admit the pattern here is troubling. The sequence is consistent enough to feel choreographed. Discovery. Missing registers, renamed cabinets, bills without cases, cover-up, slips collected, drawers locked, attendants rotated out. Implication: a structure built not to cure but to contain, protecting a surname first, a patient second. Eve. And cautious scholars concede that, given the family's prominence, absence itself becomes suspicious. What the clinic refuses to hold openly, rumour holds loosely. Whispered identifications circulate, always off the record, always just plausible enough to persist. Yet the surviving evidence remains stubbornly procedural. Memos, accounts, instructions. The story advances by redaction, every blacked-out line moving the narrative forward in negative space. Decades later, one artifact escapes the purge. From an ash bin, a half-charred sheet is recovered. Its top is cinders, the middle blistered. The ink at the bottom buckles, but endures. It carries no letterhead, no signature, no date. Only the remnant of a sentence that cancels all doubt about intent. The scrap reads, "Family line continues." Taken together, the gaps function like entries. Payments without patients, nurses without notes, cabinets without contents, and the burned line that outlived its own destruction. The clinic's archive does not tell a medical story. It records a policy: silence bought, silence enforced, silence preserved. And in that silence, a dynasty protects what it most fears the public will recognize. The paper trail begins in property ledgers, not family letters. Inventory books from the late 19th century show estates meticulously maintained on the fringes of Vienna and in the Bohemian countryside. Taxes paid on time, roofs repaired, grounds kept, but no principal in residence. Staff lists name only caretakers and a steward. The owner line is left blank or replaced with an initial that matches no local registry. The accounting is precise, the occupancy is a void. Cross-referencing household registers with parish records yields the same absence. Baptisms, marriages, funerals cluster in nearby villages, while the manor's columns of visitors and guests remain empty month after month. The effect is not neglect. It is maintenance without purpose, a house kept ready for someone who never arrives. Estate purchases of coal, lamp oil, and linen continue in regular cycles, suggesting nightly illumination and fresh beds in rooms no neighbor has entered. When historians widen the search, a pattern emerges in family correspondence, an unnamed relation unsuitable for society, for whom arrangements have been made and about whom correspondents are told not to speak further. The destination is never written, only the assurance appears. The matter is contained. The phrasing aligns too neatly with the properties that kept running without residents to dismiss as coincidence. Local testimony fills in what the records refuse to declare. Farmers recall lights in upper windows on nights when no carriage was seen at the gate. A seamstress hired to mend curtains says she left the bundle at the service door because the family does not receive. A coachman, dismissed early from a delivery, remembers a figure standing behind a curtain on the second floor, motionless, as if placed. None of these accounts are sworn statements, but their consistency across towns and years is notable. The heirs. Height above, silence below. Genealogical charts echo the architecture of absence. Branches that should extend simply stop. A cousin's name appears without dates, without issue, and without further trace. Where documentation elsewhere is exhaustive, these gaps strain credulity. A modern genealogist puts it plainly. In families of such prominence, absence here is not accident, it is intention. The truncated lines on parchment mirror the closed shutters on stone. Both record a choice to remove a person from view while preserving the structure that proves they existed. Financial logs strengthen the implication. Wages for night watch and special maintenance are paid quarterly. A physician's retainer appears tied to no local practice. Deliveries enter by the service lane after dusk. The rhythm is steady, like an institution running at low power, enough to function, not enough to be seen. Taken together, the estates operate as containers, properties curated to shelter lives that would not be acknowledged. The grounds remain trimmed, the chimneys draw, and the ledger lines balance, all to support a presence the record will not name. The last entry in a village memoir captures what the documents cannot resolve. On a winter evening, the writer walks past the manor and pauses. Snow whitens the hedges, the gate is locked. Yet high in the east wing, one window glows with steady light. No footstep, no voice, no hint of movement follows. Only that square of brightness, untouched, inexplicable, still shining against the night. The Rothschild genealogical charts were once models of precision. Marriages inked in perfect symmetry, birth and death neatly paired like figures in an account book. But over time, what began as clarity devolved into confusion. In the earliest registers, each of Meyer Amschel's descendants extends predictably. 5 sons, 5 branches, spreading across Europe. By the late 19th century, however, those branches begin to fold back on themselves. Cousins reappear as spouses. Birth years overlap. Identical names repeat within a generation. The result is less a tree than a circuit. Archivists tracing these charts note a subtle shift in tone. Early entries are written confidently in black ink. Later ones show hesitation, erasures, cramped margins, incomplete lines. A London archivist describes the texture of correction, as if each generation rewrote the last. Even the dates grow uncertain. Deaths recorded months after the fact. Marriages left undated. Baptisms noted but never verified. Genealogy, once the family's proud proof of continuity, begins to look like an instrument of concealment. Patterns emerge in the repetition. The same first names, Nathan, Hannah, Lionel, recur not by chance, but by rule, producing confusion even among scholars. A letter from a 19th century family historian laments, "I cannot tell one Lionel from another. The blood refuses new names." Within the repetition lies an unintended metaphor. Identity folded inward until it becomes indistinguishable. Medical annotations, rarely included in aristocratic family trees, appear here in the margins under vague euphemisms: fragile, melancholic, delicate. In several cases, a line simply halts without reason. One descendant's chart stops at age 22, another's lists married, no issue, followed by a blank where a spouse's name should be. Elsewhere, entire sub-branches vanish between printings, versions of the same chart quietly remove them, leaving unconnected roots where lives once were. Cross-referencing these omissions with estate inventories and clinic ledgers reveals overlap. Each missing branch corresponds to a family member quietly relocated or never mentioned again. Dr. Anselm Kruger, who examined these patterns, calls them paper disappearances, corrections made not by history, but by intention. The effect is cumulative. What should clarify ancestry instead clouds it. Even the artistry of the trees seems complicit. Illuminated scrolls display ornamental flourishes masking abrupt endings. Decorative vines cover spaces where names were once written. In one 1870 edition, the parchment folds conceal a faint erasure, a child's initial almost visible beneath a floral border. To the casual viewer, the tree is intact. To the historian, it is full of ghosts. By the early 20th century, the family tree no longer functions as record, but as defense, an artifact polished to display unity while concealing fracture. What is missing speaks louder than what remains. As one genealogist concludes after years of reconstruction, it is a diagram of denial. The ink tells one story, the gaps another. In the end, the Rothschild genealogy stands as its own coded confession, a lineage drawn too carefully, perfected until it betrays itself. Its silence is not ignorance, but design, and in that silence lies the family's truest inheritance. The Rothschild name appeared in every financial journal of the 19th century, but not always in the ways it should have. Whenever illness, scandal, or internal discord surfaced, the press record shifted as if edited by an unseen hand. What was once news quietly vanished, replaced by silence, as deliberate as any headline. Early Paris correspondence spoke of envelopes delivered by messengers from the family's agents. The payments were not threats, but gestures of courtesy, subscriptions, donations, or advertisements that conveniently changed editorial priorities. A single folded note might buy the removal of a story or the softening of a paragraph. One journalist's diary captures the mechanism plainly. They came without menace, only precision. By morning, my editor said the matter was no longer news. In London, similar interventions took subtler forms. The Times and Morning Chronicle maintained policies of sensitivity toward benefactors. Archives show missing editions where social pages or obituaries were trimmed mid-column. Scholars examining microfilm reels find abrupt discontinuities, articles beginning with "a gentleman of finance" on one day, then disappearing entirely the next. The redaction is too surgical to be accident. The influence extended beyond newspapers. Letters from museum curators and archivists reveal how the family's donations purchased not only prestige, but curatorial discretion. A Viennese archivist later confessed that entire packets of correspondence were transferred upon request to private collections, never to be catalogued again. His account matches the gap now visible in the Austrian state archives, missing files from precisely the years of the family's internal crises. A pattern forms: journalists paid to forget, archivists encouraged to misplace, publishers rewarded for compliance. No law was broken, yet history itself was quietly rewrit, and through omission. Financial might became the instrument by which the family controlled its own portrayal, a privatized censorship built on gratitude rather than fear. Even respected historians were not immune. Those granted access to private archives worked under strict supervision. Citation of certain letters was forbidden. Researchers later described the experience as writing footnotes with one eye closed. The family's public image, disciplined, industrious, philanthropic, remained untouched, while traces of hereditary illness or personal tragedy evaporated from the record. Modern analysts regard this as one of the earliest sustained efforts at brand management. Control of narrative became a form of capital, an invisible asset that yielded returns across generations. As Professor Alan Vickers observed, they controlled not only wealth but memory. The power to omit became the power to define. By the early 20th century, the pattern was complete. Histories of finance mentioned their triumphs but never their absences. Public memory became selective, curated through meticulous deletion. For most readers, the Rothschilds existed only in success. Failure and fragility had been edited out with the precision of a banker balancing accounts. It was a perfect paradox. Immortality achieved not by what was remembered, but by what was erased. As one historian concluded, looking over yet another vanished citation, they didn't just bank capital, they banked memory. The discovery began with an accident. In the archives of the Austrian National Library, a set of mislabeled folders, once marked Property Receipts, 1870 to 1873, was found to contain letters instead of ledgers. The envelopes were swollen and warped, their seals dissolved by water. Ink had bled across pages, words running like veins into silence. The archivist who opened them noted that the script was distinctly 19th century French, and several carried embossed seals bearing a familiar crest, the 5-arrow emblem of the Rothschilds. At first the find was treated as incidental, a misplaced cash from one of the family's Viennese banking houses, but closer inspection revealed the contents were personal, dates aligned not with business transactions, but with the family's medical correspondence from Paris and London. Each letter was numbered, as though part of a sequence, but gaps appeared throughout. Of 26 references, only 12 letters survived. Authentication came slowly. Historians used ultraviolet light to recover what little remained legible. Some passages matched handwriting from known family physicians. Others contained coded initials consistent with the earlier Paris ledgers. A recurring phrase, "L'état se répète," The condition recurs, appeared in several fragments, always in the same careful hand. Yet every letter ended abruptly, as if the final line had been intentionally cut away. One historian, Dr. Havers, noted that the degradation itself seemed deliberate. The water damage did not follow natural staining patterns. It pooled at the margins, sparing seals but erasing signatures. To her, the letters had been doused before storage, not after. Another scholar described the find as an archive that was meant to survive, but not to speak. The letters mentioned patients only by initials, MR, recurring most frequently, alongside references to confinement, travel, to Vienna, and administrative resolution. No diagnoses are stated. Instead, the language drifts toward euphemism, episodes, temperament, containment. In one partially legible section, a physician writes, "The family prefers discretion to cure." The final page of the final letter is the most damaged. Its top half is dissolved entirely, but the bottom carries a single surviving line in faint brown ink. "Let the correspondence end here. The remainder has been destroyed as instructed." When the letters were displayed briefly under climate control, the accompanying curatorial note avoided speculation. It merely observed that context appears deliberately fragmented. Cross-reference with other archives confirmed as much. Journals and estate records that should have overlapped with these letters had been removed or replaced with blank placeholders. For modern historians, the Vienna papers are both discovery and obstruction, evidence not of what happened, but of how meticulously it was concealed. As Dr. Havers later wrote in her report, "Time loosened one hinge no more." In modern laboratories, the Rothschild question has shifted from rumor to research. Where 19th century physicians spoke in euphemism, today's scientists speak in data. Yet even data has boundaries. The problem, they say, is not absence, but access. The first genetic inquiries emerged quietly in the 1990s, when university teams in Vienna and Geneva began tracing hereditary markers in long-established European families. The Rothschilds, with centuries of documented lineage, presented an unparalleled case study. But almost immediately, researchers encountered resistance. Requests for biological material, archived hair, blood slides, or medical tissue from historical autopsies were denied by both private estate councils and partner institutions. The explanation was diplomatic: family privacy. The effect was absolute. Historians argue that such reticence undermines transparency. Geneticists counter that they cannot analyze what they cannot access. Dr. Lisa Bernard of Zurich University, who has spent 2 decades studying hereditary neurological traits in European dynasties, describes the issue as a conflict between the ethics of the living and the curiosity of the dead. Her frustration is measured but unmistakable. "We're not chasing scandal. We're chasing patterns that might explain disease." In a symposium held in 2012, Bernard presented data drawn from secondary records, baptismal mortality rates, early death certificates, reports of nervous collapse. The findings suggested recurrent anomalies consistent with recessive inheritance. Her paper never reached print. A publisher withdrew it after legal consultation, citing unverifiable lineage. No correction was issued. It simply disappeared from the journal's upcoming list. The suppression was not overt. No threats, no lawsuits, just the quiet pressure of influence. Funding boards advised caution. Museum curators who controlled access to archives grew suddenly unresponsive. As one editor later admitted in private correspondence, "There are lines history may cross, but science may not." Within the geneticist community, the Rothschild study became an unspoken test of integrity. Some argued that pursuing it risked politicizing science. Others claimed avoidance was itself a political act. Conferences referenced the case obliquely under phrases like historical heredity complications. Even when no names were spoken, everyone understood. A turning point came when a junior researcher at the Max Planck Institute disclosed that remnants of 19th century medical collections preserved in sealed government archives, contained specimens from patients identified only by initials, matching those in the Paris and Vienna documents. Verification was impossible without authorization, and authorization was perpetually pending. The samples, if genuine, could settle a century of conjecture. But the file is marked Zugang gesperrt, access denied. In the ethics debate that followed, institutions drew their lines sharply. Museums claimed guardianship. Universities claimed neutrality. The families involved issued no comment. Every discussion ended where it began, with the boundary between truth and permission. At a closed symposium in 2021, one attendee summarized what most now quietly acknowledge. Leaning close enough that his words were never recorded, he said only, "The samples exist. They are sealed." Miriam Rothschild's life unfolded at the edge of two legacies, one of brilliance, the other of burden. Publicly, she was celebrated as a pioneering naturalist, a collector of butterflies, and an advocate for humane science. Privately, her journals reveal a deeper motive for her philanthropy: atonement. Her decision to fund schizophrenia research was not a coincidence of scientific interest, but an act of reckoning. Her diary fragments, water-stained and unevenly dated, open with a single confession. "There is an inheritance we do not speak of, yet I cannot turn away from it. To fund its study is perhaps the only way to lessen its hold." The words have no theatrical flourish. They read like quiet absolution. To Miriam, science offered the only language that could replace shame with inquiry. In the years after World War II, she directed her wealth toward medical institutes studying mental illness, particularly schizophrenia. At a time when the condition was stigmatized even among physicians, her donations arrived with precise stipulations, funding only those projects devoted to the biological origins of psychosis. Dr. Elaine Webster, a historian of medical philanthropy, later remarked, "She did not scatter her wealth broadly. She placed it exactly where she believed it would touch the problem closest to her house." Within her own family, her actions drew unease. Letters exchanged between cousins refer to her as too candid, her philanthropy inviting scrutiny. One note, unsigned but preserved among her correspondence, reads, "She gives too much to causes that turn mirrors toward us." Miriam's reply, scribbled in the margin of the same sheet, cuts through generations of silence. How can silence heal? Her approach to giving became more deliberate as criticism deepened. She requested anonymity in several grants, preferring that results speak without her name attached. Yet even concealed, her pattern was recognizable. Each institution she aided had, in some archival way, touched the family's past. Clinics once consulted, doctors once retained, cities once associated with Rothschild heirs who had quietly vanished. Contemporaries described her as compassionate but restless. A colleague recalled her pacing the halls of her Northampton home before major donations, murmuring that she owed the debt of memory. To friends, she appeared driven by moral gravity. To her kin, by guilt. Historians still debate which was closer to the truth. Her philanthropy achieved recognition, but not reconciliation. The family maintained its polished reticence, grateful for her prestige, but unwilling to share her candor. At award ceremonies, her relatives applauded from the back rows, their smiles polite, their silence heavy. In her final journal, the handwriting trembles, yet the clarity remains. Beneath an unfinished entry on insect migration, she writes a final line that seems to step out of science and into confession. "I do not give for them to see. I give because I cannot forget." It is not the note of a benefactor, but of a witness. A woman who understood that knowledge, like inheritance, carries both fortune and debt. By the late 20th century, the Rothschilds had mastered the art of lineage management. Their name still appeared on banks, endowments, and universities, each branch polished by success. Yet in interviews and private reflections, a subtler inheritance emerges, the unease of descendants who grew up inside a legacy that could not be questioned. When modern historians began collecting oral testimonies from living heirs, most spoke cautiously. Pride came first, stories of discipline, education, philanthropy. But as conversations lengthened, words began to falter. One descendant, born in the 1950s, admitted, "We were taught never to mention illness. If someone grew strange, we said they'd gone abroad." Another recalled how the family avoided doctors outside a tight inner circle, preferring discretion to diagnosis. What had once been secrecy had become reflex. The aversion to psychiatry was especially striking. In families where therapy became fashionable, the Rothschilds remained wary. A relative living in Geneva told researchers, "We trust accountants, not psychologists." He laughed after saying it, then added, "My grandmother said the mind is a vault. Best to keep it locked." The remark, half in jest, carried generations of instruction. Silence as preservation, denial as self-defense. Several testimonies reveal how that silence turned inward. One interviewee described an uncle who refused hospital treatment for depression, insisting it was a family temperament. Another spoke of cousins who changed surnames to escape scrutiny. The past, rather than fading, seemed to press forward, its vocabulary of discretion now reshaped into avoidance. Researchers documenting these accounts noticed recurring behavioral patterns, heightened privacy, distrust of institutions, the tendency to conceal distress even among relatives. It was not secrecy in the old sense, but fatigue, a psychological toll of centuries spent managing reputation. Dr. Klaus Reiter, who studied these transcripts, summarized it as the pathology of inheritance, not madness, but the exhaustion of containment. And yet, amid the unease, a few voices broke from the lineage of denial. A young descendant, interviewed for a private oral history project, spoke without hesitation. "We carry what they hid. I don't know its name, but I know it's real." She declined to elaborate, only remarking that her family feared mirrors. Another recording, made off the record during a research session, captures a pause before confession. The interviewer asks if mental illness still troubles the bloodline. The reply is quiet, the tone measured but final. "I will not give you names. But yes, there is still someone, a relative. Even now, they hear voices." The tape ends with a soft mechanical click. In that silence, the dynasty's story loops back to its beginning. Ambition entwined with affliction, wealth shadowed by something it cannot quantify. The ledgers have long closed, the estates restored, the archives polished for exhibition. But beneath the heritage lies an echo that will not fade. Even now, they hear voices. Every inquiry into the Rothschild mystery ends where it began, in documentation. Pages catalogued, letters half burned, names coded in ledgers that survived not by chance, but by curation. Historians and geneticists have walked the same narrow corridor of evidence for decades, emerging with conclusions that never quite meet. The family's wealth was vast, its archives vaster still, and somewhere between the two lies a silence that money could maintain, but never quite erase. The historians see design in the pattern. Omissions repeated across generations, identical phrases, delicate temperament, fragile constitution, retired abroad, appearing in records a century apart. To them, the story is one of management, not mystery. What others call genetic curse, they call bureaucratic control, a dynasty pruning its image like a portfolio. As Dr. Anselm Kruger wrote in his final report, if secrecy can endure this long, it is not a symptom, but a system. The geneticists disagree. To them, patterns of concealment suggest continuity of condition, not conspiracy. They point to the sealed medical archives, to the specimens marked with the same initials that appear in the Paris and Vienna files. The samples exist, one said, but access is forbidden. Yet, even if those barriers fell, results would raise more questions than they settle. Illness, after all, is not inheritance alone. It is the shape memory takes when bound by fear. Between these camps, academic rigor and ethical restraint, stands the family itself, offering neither denial nor admission. Publicly, the Rothschilds are monuments to philanthropy and culture. Privately, they have no comment on legacy. Their silence, once a means of control, has become a kind of immortality. As one historian observed, they learned that to speak is to date oneself, to remain unspoken is to outlast inquiry. The case now rests in fragments. A ledger fur, Rom Frankfurt, a burned scrap from London, a torn letter from Vienna, and modern whispers from living heirs who no longer believe the past can be fully archived. The documents contradict one another just enough to ensure ambiguity. Every discovery opens a question. Every question closes another door. What survives are impressions, like fingerprints on fogged glass, proof that someone touched the truth, briefly, before it vanished again. In the final symposium dedicated to the topic, debate gave way to resignation. A historian summed it up quietly, looking over the projected image of the red shield crest. Perhaps the mystery isn't what they hid, but how well they learned to. The room fell silent. No rebuttal followed. And so the investigation ends, not with revelation, but with the weight of what cannot be verified. The Rothschild archive remains intact, its locks unbroken, its contents whispered about, but never shown. Somewhere in a controlled vault, a final ledger rests on its side. Closed, but not sealed. Its pages are blacked out, its ink long dry, yet beneath the silence it seems to hum faintly, as if remembering what it was made to forget.